Thank you. Well, to start with the interview, we have prepared some questions about you, ACT, contextual therapies. And well, this is the first question. The first question is, during the last decades, Stephen Hayes' name has been mentioned in different places and in different languages because of the work you did in ACT, RFT, contextual therapies, and so on. What was it like for you to receive all that recognition? Did you find it manageable, or did it generate some complications for you?
Yeah, well, the complications grow over time, but it comes with the territory. I've tried in my career to lead from behind, not from out in front, because I have the belief that real transformational change happens because of groups. And I was a political and labor a political organizer in the environmental movement before I became a graduate student. And my mentor was a labor organizer in California. And that was something he impressed upon me, and it's never left me. And so I've started multiple organizations, the American Psychological Society, and now the Association for Psychological Science in the US of A, which is the largest psychological science group in the US. And I started it, I organized it, I had the first office in my lab. Very few people know that. And I'm happy that very few people know that. I'm getting an award from them here in about a month for my work. And I will accept the award on behalf of the people who started it, who started the association. I started an association called the Association for Applied and Preventive Psychology, which failed because of some mistakes that I made. And now HCBS, the group that organizes and fosters contextual behavioral science group work, which is now more than 20 years old, and looks like it will be a relatively permanent success. You never know about permanence. You know, the work becomes important because of the work of others. There's no way that ACT, CBS, RFT, process-based therapy, functional contextualism, all these things would have. I'm being asked a second. Let me respond by Zoom to agree that I'm speaking English. There's no way that any of those would have become popular without the work of dozens and then hundreds and then thousands. That's what popularity means. So the problem becomes, sorry for such a long answer for such an easy question, that eventually people want the person who sort of started it or something to go out in front. And then in order to get some things done, I've had to do that. So in writing books and giving talks, it's a dangerous thing because it undermines the prosperity of the group if it's done wrong. So I welcome it, but it's a challenge. It becomes ridiculous how many hours a day I have to answer emails, 3-4 hours a day just to keep atop. So be careful what you wish for if you're wanting to, but also keep your eye on what you're trying to do. The thing that keeps me moving forward on this, in a way, unwelcome notoriety, is that I know in the long run it's not about me, and it's about the good that these things can do in a part of an evolving system. They can't do good and just stay still. Well, they can, but for a limited time. So It's been disorienting. To the short answer to your question is it's been disorienting, exhausting. It feeds my ego. I have a very good wife who beats my head with a stick when my hat won't fit my head. But I don't take it too seriously, and I try to meet the burden while still focusing on what people can do in community to uplift the world.
Mhm.
And so that's one reason I'm talking to you this morning,
Oh,
having my morning coffee, and haven't yet even kissed my wife good morning, but I'm here talking to you, and because you're important, your voice matters. So
th-
that's the way I try to think about it. And
thank you so much for those words. I think you are like a celebrity we have in psychology nowadays. Well, my other question is, a relevant event in the history of contextual therapies was your publication in 2004 of the famous article called Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, Relational Frame Theory and Third Wave of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies.
yeah.
Could you tell us about the development of that article and how did you feel to have worked on it?
Yeah, it's an interesting story because it was my presidential address for the Association for Behavioral Cognitive Therapies, the main CBT group in the United States. And I did not run for president. Usually people campaign for the nominations and so forth. And I'm not above doing that. I mean, I've started multiple organizations, as I said earlier, and I've run for offices because it's important to be part of the administrative group. But I don't know how it happened. Some group of people nominated me, and I decided to run. But this was I think my presidential year was in 1997, 98, or it could have been 98, 99. My memory gets a little foggy the older I get. And that article was in 2004. Why? Well, when I gave my presidential address to ABCT, which, by the way, one reason I say I lead from behind and so forth, part of that is I had a panic disorder. And I
Yeah.
still am I call myself a panic disordered person in recovery because who knows, I may have it again here right now and be unable to speak. And that's okay. You know, I'm open to that if that's what life's going to give me, and I'll see if I can do a good job with it. But so when I first got the call, will you run for president? You've been nominated. A whole bunch of people have nominated you. Within a millisecond, I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to give a presidential address, which was terrifying. But it was also exhilarating. I think I did a pretty good job, and I stepped up to it. Um, but then I had to write the presidential paper, and that was more challenging because it was time for CBT to take a different form. And it had done that before. I mean, CBT comes out of behavior therapy, behavior analysis, behavior modification. At the time, these groups were all together, and Al Bandura would be talking to, a Don Bear, the behavior analysts and the social learning people were together because they were fighting the good fight for data and sometimes for limiting the excesses of psychodynamic psychoanalytic thinking. I had a conference here at UNR on the history of the behavior therapies and caught it just at a time when people were getting of an age like my age now, where they maybe make a final statement. And so Bandura and Don Bear and all these huge, well-known figures came to our little campus and talked about that history. And it was so emotional that, Al Bandura literally cried on stage because of feeling as though his friends and allies, after all, he wrote the book Principles of Behavior Modification. Yeah.
Yeah.
But he was also a social learning type, a cognitive type. And his theory of cognition was not so behavioral, and the behavioral people didn't like that. And he felt abandoned by them, really, or even attacked by them. But that was true in all directions. The more behavioral people felt abandoned by the more cognitive people. And I remember when that happened, I'm old enough to have seen the transition and literally walking through the halls and seeing these huge crowds for Aaron Beck, and feeling as though the world had changed and being a little concerned about it because while I thought it was necessary, also, well, the way I said it, it's the wrong move for the right reason.
Mhm.
Because we needed to do a better job of cognition. I'd come to believe that, but I also believe that adopting more clinical theories of cognition would not be progressive because it's too easy. It's just like clinical theories of personality. It's too easy to just get caught up in cultural beliefs. Then you start chasing lay concepts, and you don't have technical terms. Well, coming back to the point, I knew that and people who were in the room certainly knew that presidential address was a declaration of a shift, but not of a shift away from, but of a shift forward with uh, the the behavioral colleagues and the cognitive colleagues, the CBT people and the behavior analysts and the behavior modifiers. Now, over the decades, these groups had kind of split and gone in different directions.
Yeah.
ABCT was still the core. I think that's true also in your country, where there's
Mhm.
sometimes divisions. And say Alamak may represent one thing, and then there's another group says, "Oh no, that it should be like this." Um, so from 1998 to 2004, 6 years, and when I finally what was I waiting for? I was waiting for a few studies to come out
Yeah.
because at the time I declared that it was the arrival of the third wave. ACT only had 3 randomized trials.
Mhm.
3.
Yeah, 3.
Well, now it has 1,100, and we're about to put up another 150. It'll be almost 1,300 within a month or so when we finally get them all indexed. Because we work so hard to get all of the work done in lower middle income countries. Sometimes they're in journals that are not even indexed in the mainstream indexing engines, which is a big problem, I think. So it took me years to put it together. And then I had to go through a review process. And boy, the reviewers hated it. And they knew it was my presidential address. If that wasn't the case, it never would have been accepted. No way that article would have been accepted. Impossible. But there was one reviewer, and I've always suspected it was Dave Barlow, my mentor, who basically said we need to let Steve speak. We can't have a situation where the flagship journal of our association won't allow the presidential address of that association to be published. But boy, it was over the voices of so many reviewers who, of the 4, I think 3 of them were saying, no, nothing has changed. What are you talking about? This is crazy. I'm being a little harsh, but so one of the things though, before I leave this topic of that article, read it carefully, and yeah, I'm saying some bold new things that now are not so bold. Everybody knows what I said was happening happened.
Mhm.
But go back and read it again because the people who felt as though it was threatening viewed it as almost like an act of burning down the house. And it wasn't. It said, look, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And that is what is happening in the cognitive wing. It's happening in the behavioral wing. It's just going to happen because our assumptions are changing and new data are coming, and there's anomalies that we have to figure out. For example, the anomaly that traditional CBT measures very rarely work well as mediators.
Yeah.
Well, that means they're not functionally important pathways of change by our standard statistics. Well, that means the model's wrong.
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
means the model's wrong. I
Yeah,
mean,
sure.
you don't like saying sentences that clearly. It needs adjustment, it needs tweaking. Yes, cognition is very, very important. And yes, I even argue now reappraisal is important, but it's not detecting, challenging, disputing, and changing. It's thinking broadly, taking what's useful and leaving the rest. That's cognitive flexibility. And cognitive flexibility was always in Beck's methods, was always in CBT. But the theory sometimes said, no, what we need to do is stop people from thinking this way and get them to think that way. That's not how it works. You don't stop people from thinking things. Once you think something, it's in your head forever, at least to some degree, because we're historical beings. So if you read the article, you'll see that I don't say, oh, this is all new and throws over CBT. And it says this builds on things that are in CBT and in behavior therapy. I said, and I had to remind my colleague Stefan Hoffman, who at the time was very defensive about this, that I said, you can call it contextual CBT if you want. I'm fine with that. And many people have since. And I walked through in the definitions what the third wave was, is that it's building on our progress up to this point, but then carrying it in a new direction. Now, I think over the now 20 years since,
Yeah.
I think almost everything I predicted would happen has happened. Almost everything I said was important is now agreed to by almost everyone in evidence-based therapy. But what I didn't quite know, and I know now, is that this journey was going to be very disruptive for other reasons that we'll probably get into. And that's now becoming evident in process-based therapy as a model of evidence-based therapy. Not a new form of therapy. I'm not trying to declare the fourth wave or anything like that, but I'm just saying, as we really dig into the processes of change that we pointed to in that article, we're realizing that our methods are wrong, our statistics are wrong. And because of that, there's a very disruptive period coming ahead over the next 10 years that probably, I think, will be more disruptive than what happened with that article. And one final thing on that article, I think the part of why it was taken to be such a challenge to mainstream CBT is it wasn't only a year later that Get Out of Your Mind Into Your Life appeared and was written up in Time magazine and in some magazines in South America, Asia, for example, in Brazil. My wife is a Brazilian, and she really ran around the house when she found out that I had been written up in what's called the Yellow Pages of Asia, which is a little 2-page section of that magazine that presidents are in and things like that. And they interviewed me, and so she was so excited. But my point being, when Get Out of Your Mind Into Your Life came out, it was cast by reporters, not by me, as a war with CBT. So that combination did make it harder and slowed, I think, the third wave down a little bit because it created some defensiveness that was unnecessary. But the article itself, that 2004 article, while it's challenging, is not hostile. And I think has held up over time. I'm proud of the article to this day. Sorry for such a long answer, but it has a long backstory, and I haven't often told that story. Thank you for the interesting question.
Thank you too. I think I didn't know anything about the story behind the article. I think it's nice to hear it from you. Thank you for that. My another question is, it's a topic that is discussed by psychologists and students I know, and that is also a question I have been asking myself since I started in contextual therapies. Is why did you not call contextualism as environmentalism?
Oh, well, it is a kind of environmentalism, but here's the problem. You have to be careful with your words, and an act in context includes the external context, external to the organism, but it also includes your history and the internal context. So, for example, for psychology, our underlying, neurophysiology are part of the whole organism acting. Our cultural history is part of the whole organism acting. Now, the cultural context is external to the organism, but the history is not. It's in and with the organism. So if you define psychology to be the level of analysis in which the whole organism is interacting in and with a context considered historically and situationally, you want a term that orients you to history and circumstance, not just circumstance. And so, yes, the history is environment, behavior, interactions. That's true. But it's also a history of behavior relations. Because once we have cognition, you can no longer get away with saying, oh, well, behavior relations are only a small thing. Of course, I can chain, I can sequence. But no. In the moment, right now, as you hear my words, there's a massive amount of what you would want to call behavior relations. If you consider behavior to be the whole of what the organism does, thinking, feeling, remembering, emoting, all those things, I want to call behavior. Not as distinct from emotion, cognition. Many people do that. Overt behavior is what they mean, behavior that is public and you can see. Well, the behavior of the organism includes the whole organism, but includes the subcomponents of the organism. I mean, as we're talking right now, for example, you're methylating genes. There's epigenetic processes that are up and down regulating the expression of your genes. Your genes are not changing. The same in every cell unless you had a mutation. But their expression is changing very, very fast. 8 minutes of meditation has an impact of something like 3% of your genome is reliably turned on and off. If you meditate for 8 weeks, it goes up to something like 13%, 11, 12, 13%. This is out of work done with the relaxation response with Herb Benson's work at Harvard. How do you speak about something like that? That's context, is it not? Yes, of course it is. If I've methylated the genes that regulate the stress response, for example, your next question may be different than it would be if I said something very distressful to you, like, these are stupid questions. Why are you asking me such ignorant things? Within seconds, your whole body may be different. And the next statement out of your mouth may be different. That's context, in my view. So contextualism, if you say just environmentalism, and you don't find a way for the history of environment-organism interactions to be part of the organism itself, when you get to these behavior relations that become very dominant, once human language and cognition becomes bidirectional, which is the great invention of the human line, The hominids clearly were doing it, so we don't know how far back it goes, but we know it doesn't go to our common ancestor with the chimpanzees. We know that because the chimpanzees don't do what your 16-month-old baby does in deriving bidirectional relations. And if your baby doesn't do that, your baby will not have normal language and cognition until you get that problem solved. Run, don't walk to a good behavioral person who can help do relational frame training. Maybe they can save your baby's psychological life by acquiring these relational operants. So that's why.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. I think it's very interesting. That answer. Okay. My next question, yes, it's different.
Could I say one more thing? By the way,
Okay.
textualism was just borrowed from Stephen Pepper's division of the main meta theories in philosophy, not philosophy of science. He was a metaphysician. But I adopted it because it made so clear some of the contradictions, some of the conflicts inside philosophy of science that I thought were intractable. And he called pragmatism contextualism. And so that was the other reason, is that there was no reason not to, if you're going to embrace some of his ideas as much as I did in helping to understand philosophical conflicts. Excuse me for that addition.
Okay, thank you for that. My next question is, if Skinner were alive, what do you think he would say about the contextualism as a new version of radical behaviorism, or a way of understanding human behavior?
He wouldn't like it, and if I got into a longer conversation, he would probably agree with the elements but disagree with the move. And I don't have to speculate on that because, of course, I knew the man. I'm old enough. I spent many hours with him, and I did talk to him about contextualism. But at the time, he was quite old, and he talked in ways that were very elaborate and complete, but were drawn from his books. You could literally almost, if you knew it well, and I did know it well, I'm a Skinnerian scholar, really, maybe now you wouldn't say I'm a very good one because I'm old and I've forgotten. But at the time, when I was your age and for decades after, boy, really, really, really reading carefully. And I often use Skinner quotes that people have forgotten because of that. But I read them very carefully. But I did have these conversations, and I think he made a mistake by calling radical behaviorism. Why? Because what's radical is that he's taking behavioral concepts and applying to himself as an analyst, as a scientist. When you do that, dramatic things happen, especially if you're an evolutionist, which he was. His dying words are about evolution. I mean, the late Don Campbell, when he was writing about variation and selection, refused to apply it to his own acts and said he wouldn't do it because it looked like solipsism. In other words, he chickened out. I mean, that's the only thing you could say, because if you're saying, I'm an evolutionist, but I'm not going to apply my analysis to myself, come on, what is that?
Yeah.
Fred had the courage to apply it to himself. And what happened when he did that? And where did he do that? Well, he did that in a 1945 paper on operationism. That's the first place radical behaviorism is mentioned. But it's also the place where he playfully says to E.G. Boring, I don't know why you guys are so externally oriented. I'm interested in boring from within. And everybody laughed. But in that paper, that famous paper, he overthrows all of Watson's prohibitions, all of them. They're gone. They're done. I mean, Watson, 1913, and later Watson is overthrown by Skinner. Private events,
Yeah.
fully legitimate scientific, now hard to study, And he says, you don't have to study them to understand overt behavior. That was a mistake. That's incorrect. I believe it's provably incorrect now. And it was mistaken because of his analysis of verbal behavior. If verbal behavior operates on, because it's bidirectional and combinatorial, the transformation of stimulus functions from relational operants, if that's what you think verbal behavior is, and that's what I think from RFT, it operates on previously existing behavioral principles. That means we can't avoid behavior relationships because cognitive behavior is a behavior. It's a weird one. It's an unusual one. But there's nothing in evolutionary science that says tips of evolutionary branches can evolve new functions. Nothing. And people hated Skinner. I'm dancing in this article, in this answer, but hated Skinner because if they were psychobiologists or evolutionists, they didn't recognize that he was an evolutionist, even though he wrote entire articles on it. Because they'd say, "Oh, you're so ignorant, you're so stupid, you have selection by the group." Well, now multi-level selection has brought that back. And most evolutionists, if you don't have multi-level selection, you better know how to dance really fancy footwork around kin selection or something, because otherwise you can't get things like altruism. So Skinner overthrows Watson and then picks as the term for that radical, which sounds extreme, but what he meant by it was to the root, meaning I'm not going to give myself a pass. I, as a scientist, have to apply the same concepts to me. Well, that means evolutionary epistemology applies to me. That means crude forms of ontology go away, I think, because, and that's why Don Campbell didn't want to go there. That's why he calls it solipsism. And I've had a couple decade-long argument with my colleague David Sloan Wilson about this. Look, if what evolves to promote what works, or specifically in the case of biological evolution, survival, is how knowledge development works, how epistemology works. How do you know it applies in a simple way to the real world? In other words, tells you what is ontologically true. And the answer is it doesn't. Go read Don Campbell's, I think, brilliant book. Has some problems, but on the case against reality. And modern evolutionist who argues, look, in the same way that we can interact with a computer system that has files that are little blue rectangles, and if you drag them over into a trash can, the file goes away. That doesn't mean that files are rectangular or blue. It has no relation to that. In the same way, because I see a snake and it has this form, says nothing about the actual reality of what we call a snake. It could be something more like the movie in the Matrix of falling green letters. How the hell would we know? All we know is if that poisonous snake, however it's formed, whatever it is, bites me, I die. And so I have a perceptual system that keeps me from dying. Okay, great. That doesn't mean it's modeling reality in any crude way. Well, okay. So here out goes the prohibition against private events. Out goes the prohibition against introspection. Skinner embraces it. And the only reason that everybody doesn't know that Skinner overthrew most of what behaviorism believed until Skinner is because he made a mistake with verbal behavior and said, but you don't have to go there to understand overt behavior. Yes, you do. If RFT is right. If I'm right, I'll say it that way. So, and I believe I have the evidence, and Fred didn't. I mean, Fred actually said he thought verbal behavior wasn't actually an empirical research program, his verbal behavior in 1957. It was an exercise in interpretation. When I first heard him say that, I went back up to my room and I metaphorically, as they say, tore my shirt, which is what Jewish people, I wasn't raised in a Jewish home. I was raised in a Roman Catholic home, but my mother was Jewish and her mother was Jewish. So I understand the metaphor. I'm done. Like if you have a child who you are abandoning and you're no longer going to you rip your shirt, and I've metaphorically ripped my shirt, said, okay, I'm not giving any more of my life's effort to that. I've answered in a wild, kind of rambling way, but I consider myself a neo-Skinnerian. I think Skinner was one of the greatest minds in psychology who ever lived.
Yeah.
I knew him, and I don't think he would like contextualism, just like he didn't like interbehaviorism. He made fun of Cantor, made fun of my first wife, Linda Hayes, Linda Parrott, her maiden name, who was Cantor's last student and really pushed Fred hard on interbehaviorism in arguments that I watched. And by the way, won them. She actually won the arguments when I watched her interact with B.F. Skinner. But if I could have a longer period of time to sit with him and walk through what is really meant by it, I consider functional contextualism to be an minor updating of radical behaviorism. And some of the terms are changed, makes it more accessible, but that wasn't really what I was trying to do. I was trying to avoid what I thought was dogmatism on the part of Skinner when he said that prediction and control is the purpose of science. And as soon as he did that, lost about half of the scientists out there who says that's not my purpose. And that was a mistake in my view. He should have said, my science has the purpose of prediction and control. I say prediction and influence because control can sometimes mean elimination of variability. And he didn't mean that. He meant influence. And I add with precision, scope, and depth so that you can get absolute control under some extraordinary circumstances. Here's a gun. I'll shoot you if you don't give me your wallet. Woohoo, I understand charity. No, you don't. Charity has nothing to do with holding a gun to someone's head and stealing their wallet. But it looks like control. I mean, I'm going to get the wallet almost every single time. 999 times out of 1,000, if I got a big gun, I'm getting that wallet. That's control. That's pretty good control. Yeah, but it doesn't tell you very much at all about people donating money. And so you really want concepts that have precision, scope, and depth. That's a minor addition. He'd agree to that. I can't think of anything else other than changing the terms in functional contextualism that he'd disagree with. In descriptive contextualism, yes, that's the argument with interbehaviorism. Or with social constructionism, Marxism, feminism, dramaturgy, hermeneutics, and all the rest of that kind of whole wing that is really quite friendly to behavioral thinking, but has a different purpose. And he was on the positive end of receiving that because, some of the people, I mean, he won the Humanist of the Year award once, B.F. Skinner. And some of the people he trained were really important to humanistic perspectives that were contextualistic. I mean, he helped create Gestalt therapy. He did, because people he trained created it. He helped buoy up some psychodynamic thinking. I mean, the person Fred mentions the most in his writing and always positively is Sigmund Freud. Go do a count. But and he had within his group of scientists, people who were in 4 days a week psychoanalysis. Charlie Furster was in 4 days a week, like one classes. And
I
his theory of depression is a mix of radical behaviorism and psychoanalytic thinking, in my opinion, on artificial versus natural reinforcers, if you know the Furster's approach, which then goes into FAP, functional analytic psychotherapy.
Yeah.
So don't put Fred into a cartoon cage. He was very interesting, but would he personally? I think if I had a long conversation, I could win him over. But the short conversations I had with him about this topic when it was early, of course, I was just a baby, and why would he listen to me? We're not successful. Let me put it that way.
Thank you for that answer. I wonder if I can ask you some questions.
Sure.
Okay. Well, my next question is something that's happening here in Peru. Trainings in contextual therapies such as ACT, DBT, FAB have grown enormously because of their great effectiveness, especially here in Peru. Several institutions promote trainings courses of 1 year. In your opinion, how should an ACT therapist be trained? Do you consider that it's enough to take a 1 year course, or it's necessary to do more?
Oh, golly. Here's my view on that. We've thought about this in terms of psychotherapy, but the underlying processes of change that are in ACT, we now know, are there in most forms of psychotherapy as functionally important pathways of change. If you look at the 2022 article in Behavior Research and Therapy, where we looked at every mediational study ever done in the history of the world, 55% of the ones that were successful are psychological flexibility measures. But if you get a little more flexible and you think about ACT ideas that are usually expressed with this hexagon model using the extended evolutionary meta model of process-based therapy, and you add social-cultural extensions. So, for example, it isn't just acceptance, it's also empathy. It isn't just diffusion, it's also being able to listen to the opinions of others. It isn't just self as context, it's attachment and a socially interconnected sense of self, and so on. Values, social values, commitments, social commitments. And taking care of your body, your in terms of your behavior, but also in terms of understanding things like epigenetics, the role of genes and brain circuits and so forth. If you do all that, all the processes of change can be fit into a single sentence, which says learn how to be more open, aware, and actively engaged in a life worth living. Extend that to others and take care of your body. And do it in a way where you try new things and you retain them based on their success, and you fit them to context based on what's needed in context. These evolutionary principles. Well, those principles are there if you are running a business, if you are teaching a class, if you are a nurse dealing with a patient, if you are a coach of a sports team, if you are a high performer of any kind, including an athlete training for the Olympics, if you're dealing with diabetes, if you're, so I don't think we should put psychology in a box and say, oh, it has to be like this. I'm a Skinnerian in this way, from rats to Walden too. You do high precision, high scope principles that can expand and go everywhere that it's needed. So if you look at a television show about immigration or poverty or climate change and climate distress, very, very, very often these important social, political, economic matters, no behavioral scientists are there, no psychologists are there. Climate change, who will be on the shows? The people who are inventing ways of carbon capture. Dude, if you don't change behavior, it's not going to make any difference.
Yeah.
Whole parts of the earth will be unlivable within your lifetime, not mine. I'm too old. Within your lifetime, unlivable. No human will be able to live there
Yeah.
if we don't do something. And who's the we? All of us. But that includes those who study how to change human behavior of all sorts, not just overt behavior. So the answer to your question, I think, would be let's find out how best to put these processes into people's lives and use all the channels that we can, all of the technology and the AI tools and what your phone is doing. And so is 1 year enough? Is 2 years enough? Is 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8? I do know this: you cannot meet the mental and behavioral and social wellness needs of the human population inside a model that says that only people trained for 8 years and with a PhD can deliver any kind of help. That's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. There's no evidence for it. I mean, we know that a self-help book read thoroughly can do half or 2/3 of what a course of psychotherapy can. Look at the data. Well, and for reasons that don't just go beyond the course, you shouldn't just give people a book and say, that's all you get, No, but books are pretty incredible. For one thing, you don't have to read them in a linear way. You can read what's interesting to you. You can stop reading a chapter if it's too geeky and doesn't seem important. That's good and bad, but it's interesting. You can't go into therapy and say, what you're saying now isn't very interesting to me. I'm just going to. Now the person would throw you out of therapy if you did that. You can do things like that with your phone. The technology to say what are the specific processes you need to target is now being developed statistically inside process-based therapy efforts. And I'm actively developing that. I'm president of a 45-year-old charitable organization that has an app called Mindgrapher that is developing what we're calling idiomatic statistical tools that if you just tell the app how you're feeling, doing, thinking, etc., a couple times a day within a couple of weeks, it'll be able to tell you, here's what you need to target, and tell your therapist. So let's let all flowers bloom. If you think a year is not enough, well, then push back on that. It is important to have professions. It is important to protect the ability of people to be able to make money based on things they've learned. But also be careful not to simply think that the world as it is now will be as the world as it is later. And guilds have a long history. Sometimes guilds say, oh, you need more, 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 more. And then when really new things happen, they say, no, 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 no. I mean, there's a phrase in English of throwing a monkey wrench into the works. Well, that came from the shoemakers trying to literally stop the shoe machines from making shoes because the cobblers couldn't sell shoes for the 25% of what it cost them to make shoes and have a good living. It was bad for cobblers, but it was good for people who are otherwise going to have bare feet. And so, yeah, in the history of the world, when you look back, was it a good thing that we had shoe making machines instead of cobblers? I'd say yes, on Yes. Was it a sad thing for the cobblers? Hugely, hugely. So what will therapy and behavior change look like 100 years from now? I don't know. I have no idea. But let's find out and maybe work together. And so I'm cautious about saying, here's how much training you need. I would rather focus on how many tools can I give you to help lift up and train you so that you have what you need. And I've done that my whole life, and so have hundreds and now thousands and now tens of thousands, and maybe even hundreds of thousands of people. I've done the math on it. I think about 120,000 people have been trained in ACT around the world. It could be much more than that. Sorry for such a long answer. I keep saying that, but I just hope forth. It's not a simple question. It sounds like a simple one.
Yeah, sure.
When we know how much training is needed to really do the job, we'll be able to do a better answer. But even then, we better put a little asterisk and say, for now. And maybe with better tools, we can train and learn faster, and we can be out there doing good in the world. Maybe in a layered way, where, yeah, there's PhD people, and there's master's people, and there's bachelor's people, and there's high school education, and maybe we can do what's happening right now with the World Health Organization taking the most downloaded document in WHO, doing what matters in times of stress, an ACT book that Russ Harris wrote. And I worked with Mark Van Omeren to help make that all happen, the head of mental health at WHO. And it's being put into Uganda by people with elementary school education, with effect sizes that are about as big as what you get in the Western moneyed world for interventions of that kind, preventative and treatment. So I don't know, maybe a layered system that goes all the way down to including things like apps, websites, books, and AI.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. I think it's this way we have to train psychologists. Well, my other question is a personal question about you. We know that you gave a well-known TED Talk about psychological flexibility. And also you talked about your personal experiences and your motivation for going into psychology. There you also mentioned something that really moved me a lot. You said the following: never again, I will not run from me, in relation to your panic attack. I would like to ask you, how do you carry that promise you made to yourself after 42 years in marriage?
Well, I am now that night on the carpet was, I believe, sometime in 1981. So it's now 43 years ago. My last panic attack, I believe, that was really to the point where I thought maybe I wouldn't be able to function in the moment just for a second. Certainly the last one where I said no, because I did it for just a second before I caught myself, was during a talk with some very famous psychologists in the room to 12 people, done here in Reno in 1995 or something like that. So I'll get that specific dates if I can think about it, because I know we're at the conference and what was going on then. Well, that's 30 years ago. So it's receding into the background, but what I do when I notice anxiety rising up in ways. Well, for example, I was giving a talk to a major podcaster in their room on the top of a penthouse looking over, and podcasters, if they're way up there, they make a good money. And I was up at a penthouse looking over a huge city and wearing earphones, and I couldn't even hear myself talk, but I could hear their questions, and it was very disoriented, and I felt claustrophobic, and my heart was like, when things like that happen, I click into this is a wonderful opportunity to practice something, and I don't get it very often anymore. And I really need it in order to be true to myself and my own history. So I welcome it, and I welcome it for kind of another reason. It's kind of like, hello, anxiety, my old friend, because, if you practice psychological flexibility skills, it begins to fall away and you enter into a different kind of flow. And it's very much welcome. Most people say they like it. But ironically, I've had clients who have actually said, I kind of miss my anxiety.
Interesting.
And I have to say, I understand that. It's there's a certain raw challenge that it gives you. But we shall see. I learned never to say never. And, if I was on Oprah tomorrow, not that she even has if you know who Oprah is, Oprah Winfrey, she doesn't have a television show anymore, but her scheduling editor called me up after Get Out of Your Mind Into Your Life and asked if I'd be available to be on the show. And I said, oh, yes, I would, but I was absolutely terrified. And then they didn't call again. So I didn't end up on the show, but I would like to think that I would welcome it as a scary and fun and interesting opportunity, and that no matter what happens, I wouldn't abandon that commitment I made that you saw in that TEDx talk. Never again. I will not run from me. And it's only works if it comes from you, but I do recommend it as a promise to make to yourself, because it's one that basically means it's okay to be you. And that you're not going to invalidate yourself by saying, basically, in order for me to move forward, I have to start from where I'm not. Nobody knows how to start from where they're not. You can only start from where you are. Well, then how do you do that if you say, yeah, but starting here is illegitimate? It's invalid. It can't be allowed, can't be permitted. Okay, dude, you realize now you've created an unsolvable problem for yourself. When I'm like this, then I will be able to move forward. Yeah, but just saying that sets a harsh thing to say. And, when I'm more confident, then I'll be able to. No, yeah, but that's the least confident thing you can say to yourself. And as I always remind people, the etymology of confident means with faith. Fident comes from the Latin word fides, which means faith. Con means with, confident, with faith. How is that acting with faith in yourself to say, when I'm different, then I can live? It isn't. So it'd be like thinking you'll get rid of a headache by beating your head with a hammer. It makes no sense. You're going to get more of a headache doing that, dude. So I would like to think that I wouldn't hit my head with a hammer, but maybe I would hit my head with a hammer. Yeah. And if I did, I'd try to forgive myself and do better next time. Because life has taught me that it's so that the best place to start from is here. Now.
It was. Yeah. Thank you for that. I completely agree. I think, as you said, life is tough. That's a nice phrase. But I have more questions. I think we're on time. So this is my last question. I would like to ask, as a curiosity, what is your favorite contextual therapy without considering ACT? Why?
Oh, well, I'd have to say FAP because for several reasons. One is FAP and ACT co-developed.
Mhm.
DBT I had some relation to, Marcia was a friend before there was an ACT or DBT. And I recognize things like CFT, but I recognize that so profoundly, I think, let me back up a little bit. Brands of therapy are an old idea that I hope passes away. Where we are right now, I'm trying to allow ACT to grow into its big shoes. And that means emifying ACT, allowing the extended evolutionary meta model to be the basis of ACT. And when you do that, ACT can grow to absorb all of the processes of change that we know are very common and important, and probably basically all of them, period, end of story, which is a little disorienting. But then ACT becomes a model of process-focused change. But others won't view it that way because it'll sound narrowly focused. What I'd say to the ACT community is, look, just don't be afraid and allow yourself to expand. But if you're going to think of these things as techniques or combinations of methods, which I've always rejected, I've always said that ACT is a name for people who are pursuing and holding themselves accountable for increasing psychological flexibility. If you do that, you're doing ACT, or if you want to call what you're doing ACT, I'm fine with it. And, we've held true to that. We've elected presidents of ACBS, people who call ACT mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training. Joe Sorochi was president of ACBS. That's what he called ACT. Did we care? No, we didn't. So, and we've elected people who use phrases like acceptance-based behavior therapy, or people in our community who call it mindfulness acceptance commitment, or MAC. But FAP is this sensitivity to the social extension of these processes, thought about using behavioral principles, and increasingly over time, including even RFT. And Bob Kohlenberg became aware of what I was doing early on because Barbara Kohlenberg, his daughter, was in my lab. And he would not have developed FAP without knowing what we were doing with rule-governed behavior and some of the early things that led to ACT. So, and we did early combos. I mean, if you had picked one, you say, well, what are the earliest combinations that you've done with ACT? The earliest ones were, of course, with any behavioral method, because right in the original ACT book, the 1999 book, it says that when we get to behavioral commitments, include all of what you know about direct behavior change efforts, whether it's exposure or, using concrete motivators if that's important, social reinforcement. Well, FAP has a whole theory of social reinforcement being used to do that. So it's a direct kind of extension of what I said ACT should include. Of course, it should include exposure. But in the stupid world of randomized trials and how we do things, you look at things like ACT for anxiety. We had to do studies with OCD and anxiety without any exposure. Why would you do that? Only for political reasons. Because if you included exposure, people would say, oh, well, of course, that's just exposure. Okay, we'll show that it's helpful even without exposure, but please don't do this. We're doing it just to show that it's helpful even without exposure, but of course you should include exposure. I mean, some of the earliest writings on ACT as an exposure-based technology. Of course you should include, because when you open up to your thoughts and feelings, what is that? That's exposure. Of course it is. No, You need to think of exposure a little differently. It's not habituation. But exposure never was habituation. That's an old idea that turned out to be false. Exposure works by previously repertoire narrowing events occurring in the presence of repertoire expansion. And so, whether that's Volpe's cats or, Michelle Krask's, observing and naming your emotion during exposure, that all makes sense from an ACT model of exposure. The same should happen with skills training. The same should happen, I believe, with using external motivators, token economies, things like that, when you have populations for whom a bridge to values-based motivation is needed. So I've said, and it creeps out the fat people a little bit because it sounds like I'm just grabbing, but I said it very early on, and I said it to Bob Kohlenberg himself. ACT plus FAP is just ACT done better.
Wow.
So if you're interested in ACT, you should be interested in FAP, and you should find out how to do ACT even better by including, sensitivity to clinically relevant behaviors, negative and positive, in the session, and using your interaction with a person to support growth and advancement. And if your client asks for a different appointment date, and you make the read, this is really hard for them to stand up to authority figures and ask for something. For goodness sakes, reschedule your appointment. Don't miss the opportunity to reinforce that socially relevant, clinically important behavior, but also one that fits inside an ACT model, of a values-based action that you want to support socially when you socially extend the psychological flexibility processes. So no, FAP has had a hard time functioning as an independent psychotherapy, period, end of story. It's combined with CBT, it's combined with ACT, it's combined with other things. And I think that there's reasons for that. And there's no reason not to learn what's inside FAP as an ACT person, because it will only do good for you and power your work. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Thank you. I would say that FAP is also my favorite therapy. I think are connected.
Yeah, they're deeply connected. They're fellow travelers. They have been from the beginning. Bob and I rubbed off each other, and I was learning about the development of FAP while he was learning about the development of ACT. And Barbara was passing like a little electric wire, things back and forth between us. Bob died a few years ago. Before he died, he was the only person, other than I think 4 other people, including me, who had been to every single world conference of ACBS. So FAP has been there inside the ACBS community from the beginning, and still is true. And I think there's others that really, really belong there, such as DBT and CFT, and we'll see where other things go over time. But yeah, if you're an ACT person and you're looking for guidance about where to do some additional training, you can't go wrong, I think, with learning some FAP sensitivities.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer, Mr. Hayes. Then, well, my last question to end the interview. Would you like to say something to the Psicontext community for their 4th anniversary, and to all the people who will be watching you soon when we post the interview on our social networks?
Yeah, I guess what I would like to say is keep your eyes wide. We're into a disruptive period. I do think the work on process-based therapy is going to be disruptive because we're now learning that processes need to be modeled ideographically, something Skinner would love, and Sidman and others. But because of the behavior-behavior relations and how central they are, they need to be modeled using complex networks. You can't simply do A-B designs anymore and think that you're really fully understanding what individual clients have to teach you. I can say without a conflict of interest, worry, because it's entirely charitable and I give money to this organization. I don't take anything from it. The work with Mindgrapher, if you watch it, it's not yet to the point where it's not released independently. It's only through other apps now that it's released. But when you begin to see it, keep your eye, watch JCBS, the Journal of the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, which is among the highest citation impact behavioral journals in the world and the most widely distributed behavioral journal in the world, because it goes to all 8,000 HCBS members. And the editor is Baljinder Sadra, the new incoming editor, just took over last week, who is a monster. I mean, she is just brilliant, hardworking, and really understands process-based therapy and idionomic analysis, this new word we have for analyzing the individual, and then looking at similarities to others, if and only if it helps us model the individual. I think the dirty history of biostatistics in eugenics isn't just a historical fact, that it's continuing to do harm today, and that we need to really push the reset button and take the 40 years of development of ACT and CBS with the development of high precision, high scope principles and concepts that now we know are involved in all of evidence-based therapy, and learn how best to measure and model them. And one reason this is important for the lower and middle income countries is that if you believe that every voice matters, we need to fight worldwide for that to be true with lower and middle income countries. We've allowed a world to evolve where 10, 11% of the world's population is producing 88% of the indexed science, and in psychology, 96%. And then if you look at citations, it's 98%. That is obscene. It has to end. And there's a spirit here where if we're going to say and believe that even in our statistics, that every voice matters, and that you need to listen to your clients, I want to add this: as an evidence-based therapist, that means measuring and modeling your clients. If you're not measuring and you're not modeling, you're not listening. And yes, you can bring your FAP skills and you can listen as really wise clinical sensitivities, but it better be informed by data. And so how can it best be informed by data? I think by measuring and modeling. When you get there, then you say, okay, the big randomized trials with gold-plated doorknobs in every direction that only can be funded in the Western, white, educated, industrialized, rich world. I hesitate to add the D for democratic. We'll see what happens, because the US of A is sprinting in the wrong direction, for example. But the so-called weird countries, those randomized trials are built upon categorical concepts that are racist, sexist, elitist. Never mind the fact that I look at things like My wife has a study, multi-site study on a really important clinical question, $11 million. 11 for one study.
Wow, impressive.
250 people, $11 million. You're going to tell me that if you don't have that, you don't have a voice? Boy, it makes me want to slap the table. That can't be. So the exciting thing, and this is my message to you, because I've visited Peru multiple times. I know how good your scholarship is. And I know that how carefully people study there and how much they know and how much those voices matter. I would actually make this as almost as an appeal, help help me, help those in the CBS community who want to bring a process focus into the world. Do this in a high quality way, one client at a time, one clinician at a time, worldwide.
Yeah.
And that maybe instead of looking to the gold-plated doorknob studies in the academic medical centers of just a few Western countries. I mean, Italy can't afford these studies. If you say Western countries, no, there's whole portions of Europe who can't afford these things I'm talking about. Not just Eastern Europe, Western Europe. So it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's like, come on, come on. We have to fight that. And fortunately, what's happening in process-based therapy, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, just watch JCBS, join ACBS, watch what's happening there. It comes free with membership. And look at the studies that are coming out where we are showing that when you go one person at a time and you measure and model, you see something entirely different and clinically very, very important than you do with these homogenized big randomized trials where human beings are error terms to statistics that are built on central tendency only and that massively distort individuals so that they do this. The action, the real place where the rubber meets the road, where real change happens, I believe, is about to shift from the big funded academic medical centers in a few Western countries to the line clinician and influencer and change agents, whether you're a coach, an OT, a PD, PT, a social worker, a teacher, I don't care, a business owner, people who want to measure and model one person at a time, the tools will be there. And we're going to find a way to somehow amplify those voices and have a world in which client by client, but also practitioner by practitioner, every voice matters. And no human being is treated as an error term.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was important for us. I think just that every voice really matters. Well, thank you so much for the interview, Mr. Hayes. I would like to ask how do you feel during the interview?
Oh, I thought they were very challenging and interesting questions. I kept apologizing for the length, but they came at me in an interesting way. You thought deeply about the topics and the opportunity, and I honor that to you and your colleagues. Because I do get a lot of formulaic questions, and these were more coming at funny angles, more interesting and fun to answer. And I hope something of what I've said has been of use to your audience.